Hi everyone. We are going to come up with some ideas for making a 3D printed bow tie. So, starting the idea of our bow tie shape here. It has a knot in the center. Two sides of the bow are symmetrical. We're going to want to create a symmetrical design, but we want to show off some of the things that we can do with 3D printing rather than just recreate the shape of something that we could make in a different way. So if we're printing this in plastic, it's going to end up being a solid shape. But we can add a lot to this and still come across with the effect of a bow tie. Center here could be a different shape if we wanted to. We can add a pattern in cutouts to the surface of the bows. And so we're going to try out some ideas using the duplicate and repeat to take shapes and move them so that we can create a repeating pattern. And we'll use the symmetrical design, the mirror tool, to create symmetrical patterns on the opposite sides of our shape. We use holes to make these cut into our bow tie so that we can make an interesting design. And once we create our design, we're going to have some way to actually wear this. So when we think about how we're going to design the backside of our bow tie, just say this is our center here and we have our bows out. And on the backside, we're going to need a way to wear this. We're going to be able to put a ribbon through some spots here. But we don't want these to be cut through the front so we can see them. So we should make an extra piece that sticks off the back here. This could be difficult to print in a way that will let you keep the supports out of the slots for the ribbons. So we're going to come up with a design where we add a notch to the back and we create a shape that will fit into that notch, and that shape will have our tabs and our slots cut into them so that we can thread our ribbon through and wear our bow tie. We're going to create a two-part design that will fit together. We are going to use duplicate, repeat, align, and mirror tools to create a repeating pattern on a symmetrical design. We'll also try out a technique for making our design in two parts that we can print and assemble afterwards. So for our bow tie, we're going to concentrate on one side of our design at a time. If I ungroup my example here, we can see that our pattern is made from a repeating set of holes. So let's take a look at how we can design this pattern, similar one. All right. Move my examples off to the side here. And we'll start by creating one side of our bow tie. So I am going to want it to be roughly triangular, and I'm going to start with the polygon shape, because I can just crank the sides down to 3 and make a nice standing triangle. We're going to design our shape to print flat on the ground because afterwards we're going to add our backer to it. Let's rotate this triangle, goes to the side, and I'm going to make this a little less than 50 millimeters. I want my final bow tie to be about 100 millimeters across. And we certainly don't want something this thick. So we're going to drop it down about 5 millimeters. I have the snap grid, I forgot to change, on 0.5, which means every movement I make can be half a millimeter at a time. I'm going to set it up to 1. Don't make some odd numbers. Now, I think I would like this side to be round. I could make a shape like this using something even like the heart. Rotate the heart 90 degrees. If I can hold my mouse down. There we go. And you could use that as the side of your bow tie, but I don't like how stretched out these ends get. I'm just going to put some cylinders on here so that I can make that bow tie shape the way that I want it. So I'll grab a cylinder and we'll change it to 5 millimeters so it matches my bow tie. And we'll increase the sides like I always like to do. Let's flatten it a bit so it is an oval. And we can move it around with our arrow keys. And let's go ahead and duplicate this. And then I can use the down arrow to just scoot it over until it touches the other corner. Now I have the shape of one side of a bow. Let's go ahead and group all of these together. And let's check our measurements. So now we are slightly above 50 millimeters. If I were to duplicate this and use my mirror tool here to flip it in the other direction, if I leave our corners overlapping a little bit, I'll end up with a bow tie that's just about 100 millimeters. I think the size is good, so for now I'm going to delete my second side because I only want to work on one, but I don't have to do the same work twice. Let's create our repeating pattern. And for this, I'm going to use the same trick that I used to create my example here, which looks like a waffle. And these holes, you can see, are pointed down here. And that is because they're upside down pyramids. Let's scroll down our list here and grab the pyramid. And any shape that you can take off of the shape palette, you can turn into a hole. I'm going to change this pyramid into a hole, and we're going to look at it from the side so that I can rotate it 180 degrees. Remember that the rotate tool is the most dangerous tool. When you click on it, keep your mouse inside the circle so that you can snap it to 180 degrees. If you accidentally move it outside and you let go at something like 6 degrees, later you might not know that this is slightly tilted, and that's going to change your design or create problems down the road. Since Tinkercad does not remember where you rotated it to, only way to get it back is to undo until you go back to a flat rotation. Be careful with the rotate. Now let's see how much this is going to cut out. I think I need to do 2 things. I want this to be a little bit wider, So I will shorten the pyramid so that the hole becomes wider. And then I also don't want a pinhole in the bottom, which is what happened on my previous design. If I don't like that, I'm going to grab the up arrow here and just drag this 1 millimeter up off. The bottom point of my pyramid hole 1 millimeter above the floor. All right. Now, just to make the hole a little more manageable, I'm going to hold down Shift and shrink the entire thing down. It stays the same shape. I have a uniform square pyramid still. And let's make our first row of holes. I'm going to select our hole as well as our bow here. We're going to go to the Align tool and line them up in the center. Now, after clicking outside and selecting the hole again, let's put the first position of our hole here. And then I'm going to use the Duplicate and Repeat button. I will click on Duplicate, which will create a copy in the exact same spot as the original. Now, using my arrow keys, I can step it over a number of millimeters. Let's say we want these holes a little closer together. You can see from above that they overlap. If we take a look a little bit closer here, you can see it's shaded where it intersects with our solid shape. So I can see that the actual part that cuts in is right here, and we'll have a nice space in between each hole. Now I want all of these to be the exact same space apart. We'll just go up here and click on Duplicate and Repeat again. As long as I have not selected a new object, Duplicate and Repeat will repeat the last move that you made. So let's duplicate until we have holes all the way along our shape. Now the middle is going to be covered with our middle piece, the sort of knot of our bow tie. I don't really have to worry about it, but I'm going to make sure that the pattern covers my entire design. And next, I want some alternating holes along the rest of this, so that they aren't in a grid, but so that they go side to side. So let's rotate our view so that we can look at this from the side. Now I can easily select all of the holes since they stick up by clicking out here in the air and dragging my selection box so it just touches the edge of my holes and nothing else. Now only the things that were touched by the box are selected. And now I've selected a new thing, I can duplicate again. And we have a new set of holes in the same spot as the original. I'm going to use my arrow keys to go up until I can see the same sort of gap upwards. And then I'm going to go left until my holes are in the middle of my previous hole. Rotate the camera around and double check. Make sure that our holes look like they are intersecting in the right spot. All right, our pattern is where we want it. We can duplicate and repeat. Make one more just to get those extra holes on the edge. Now we have a lot of extra holes because we duplicated this, but it doesn't matter much because holes that don't intersect with something will simply disappear when we group them. We could clean our design up by deleting holes that are out in space that don't do anything, but it's not absolutely necessary. I'll delete them just so that it's easier to see what's going on. Next thing we need is to do the same on the opposite side so we have a symmetrical pattern. Now I could do the exact same trick going in the other direction, but instead I'm going to use duplicate and mirror to flip this over to the other side. Let's select these holes, only want the ones up on the top side. I'm going to duplicate them, and then I'm going to go to the mirror tool. And because we have multiple things selected, you can see it'll flip the entire selection like it's a group. Now that looks like a mess. It's layered on top of the other one. Be careful not to select anything else. If you click somewhere, you're going to have a hard time getting all of those intersecting boxes selected. I'm going to use the arrow keys to just slide mine over. And because we are using snap to millimeter, I can simply move the same number of millimeters in the opposite direction, and everything will line up perfectly. If you're using some different shapes, you might have a more difficult time lining everything up, but if you stick to a grid, you can move things exactly the same amount. You can count the number of times that you have hit the arrow key. Now that we have the holes for our entire design, I'm going to drag a box around everything, and we're going to group it together. So now I've got my crazy waffle pattern on a bow tie shape. And it doesn't cut all the way through. Front is just going to look like an interesting texture. So let's change it to a waffle color now, just for fun. Now we need to make our opposite side. So once we have done all the work we want on this side's design, simply go back and duplicate the whole thing. Use our mirror tool, flip it to the other side. Now we can use the arrow keys, and we don't have to worry about how this overlap looks, because we're going to cover up the center with another shape. So at this point, I want to make sure that this design is the maximum size of print. So I'll double check the size again. We are just under 100 millimeters, so it looks good to me. So I'm going to group both of these together. You can group things to each other any number of times. The more groups you add, the more you will have to go back in and ungroup if you want to change something in a deeper group. At this point, I would need to ungroup to get my two shapes, ungroup again to get my whole pattern, and if I add more groups on, it can be more and more difficult to go back. But grouping allows us to use this as a single object, therefore, I can align things to the center. Since these are identical shapes, I know the center is exactly where I want it to be. So for mine, I'm going to use a box, but we could theoretically use whatever kind of shape we want as the center. And let's drag this 20 millimeter box down so it is just a little bit taller than our bow tie. Bow tie is 5, so actually just going to go and make this just a tiny 6, maybe 7. Looks good. But we want to make sure that's exactly in the center. So let's select everything, go back to our align tool, and hit that center circle. Hit the center circle on the other side too. Make sure it's centered up and down, and the whole thing is symmetrical. And this box is a little bit pointy, so I deselect and then select the box. I'm going to head over to radius. So in our control panel for the box, we can increase the radius of corners. This will cause the entire box to be rounded, and how round it looks depends on the number of steps. We can see if we look a little closer that there are 10 flat faces to make this curve. If we increase the number, it becomes even smoother. If we decrease it, we can get an effect where instead of a curve, we just have a straight bevel cut into our box. Makes it look kind of like a gemstone. I think I like that for this one. We'll use it. All right. Now, the last bit functional bit. If we were to add some holes to the bottom of this so that we could attach a ribbon, we would have a hard time getting it in there, as well as if we had holes in the underside, they would probably need support, and they might intersect with our waffle pattern. So we're going to add shape. Also, for a second reason, this way, when you disconnect this bow tie from our handle here, you can more easily tie some ribbon onto it. And you don't have to squeeze your fingers in between small gaps. We'll make this so it's easier to use, and you can make one of these and create interchangeable bow ties that you could swap out. So our attachment is going to be a roof shape. The reason for this is that the slope here means that I can print my bow tie without supports inside of our hole. Since these are up at a 45 or steeper angle, we're not going to need to support them. If I just cut a box in this, the roof of the box would need supports to hold up flat surface in there. Let's hold down Shift and shrink our box until it is smaller than the bow tie here. Make sure that it's going to intersect the way I want it to. And in order for it to not fall out the bottom, we're going to need to raise this up a few millimeters. So it looks like I need to make this a little bit smaller. Holding down Shift so that it doesn't get squashed flat. We'll make a 3 millimeter hook for this. And we will center it by selecting them both, aligning, and making sure that we're going to align this guy to our red shape here. Click on the box, and you can see the align tools will move to the box. Now, if I click on the center circle here, I'm going to move my roof without changing the position of the box. All right. This looks like it's in the right spot. I'm going to need to make the rest of my design. The rest of it, I'm going to need this to go underneath the floor, because I don't want the back of this to rest exactly on the surface of it. When creating parts that assemble to each other, we don't actually want them to be exactly the same size, because then they will take a lot of force to push together, and they might not ever come apart. They need a little bit of space for a little wiggle room so that you can move things in and out. So, let's add a box. Oh, can't do it while I'm aligning. Add a box. There we go. And we're going to make this thing a lot smaller. So, we'll stick with a 2 millimeter shape here. Bring it down so it only intersects our triangle. And let's make sure that both of these are long enough they'll go into our bow tie. I know that the bow tie box 20. Let's make these 15 millimeters long. Perfect. Now I'm going to center this on our shape here. The align tool, select the roof so it doesn't move, and center our box. Now we have a shape that we are ready to cut out of this, but we want to make the full piece first. So I'm going to make a duplicate of our shapes here. And we'll move them out of the way. And we know that we're going to create a backing for this that has some holes in it that we can use for the ribbon attachment. We're going to use the original here as a hole to cut this out. Now, as I said before, if I make this hole exactly the same size as this, it's going to be very difficult to put these things together and to take them apart. So let's group our two shapes so that we treat it as one, turn it into a hole. Now I'm going to go down to my snap grid for this purpose, and I'm going to turn it down to 0.5 millimeter. The reason I want it to be 0.5 millimeter is I don't want this to get too big. I want to go up just 1/2 millimeter. Remember to hold down Shift so that I don't change the shape of this, I only change the size in all 3 directions at the same time. So if I go up 5.5, I know that the entire thing is 0.5 millimeter bigger all the way around. Just enough that there'll be space to move my parts in and out, and they won't get stuck together. Now, we can use the arrow keys to move our hole into position. Remember that since this is exactly 15 millimeters, it's going to slide into our bow tie from the bottom and fit exactly in this space. Just to be sure that our 15 millimeter thing will not stick out the bottom, I'm going to go ahead, put this hole in the center, close to it. And then we're going to use the black handle here and drag it out so that it's long enough to cut through the side. So I know that I'll have an opening complete on the outside that I can put it together at the end. Now that we have our hole and everything, we can group the entire bow tie together, cut the hole through all of the objects at once. This way we have a single shape, the hole all the way through, should print very well. Now we've got to finish our handle. And remember, we want the bottom of this to be underneath the floor so that it doesn't intersect with our bow tie there. I'm going to click on my box here, duplicate it, and then use the height tool to drag it all the way under the ground. We're going to make a 2 millimeter tall, probably 3 would be better. Oops, still on 1/2. Let's switch off of this 0.5, go back to 1, so I can stick with round numbers. And we want this to be fairly wide so there's some space outside of the hook that we can attach our ribbons to. Let's take a look at it from the top, and we can grab one side. Oops. Undo that. Let's zoom in so that I can grab the handles without getting the wrong one. If we drag one side, we can do this same on each side to make it identical, or we can hold down Alt, and Alt will change your size from the center instead of from the opposite side. So let's bring this whole thing out a little less than the size of this, so it will be hidden behind it. And just to make sure that there's enough gap in between these two, let's go ahead and pick this and raise it up 1 millimeter. This way, we know that the triangle will fit in here, but there'll be a little bit of an extra gap behind it so that we can get our handle in there. And lastly, we need some holes. I'll just grab a new box and make it roughly the right size. We want to be sure, and when we're looking at this grid, we can see exactly 1 square is exactly 1 millimeter. So I'll move this so that I know that I have a couple of millimeters on each side. That way I know this is strong enough that it's not going to break off while we're wearing our bow tie. So since this is below the floor, our hole sits on top of it, and I need to go up here and grab my up and down handle and just punch it through. Looks good. Let's duplicate this and use the arrow keys to just step it 1 millimeter at a time over until we know we are 2 millimeters from the edge here. Perfect. Now let's select our entire handle here and group it. So if we move down 1 millimeter, we should be able to fit this exactly in space that was prepared. Looks good. All right, space is 0.5 millimeters larger, but will look a little bit odd. Now I'm going to hit D to drop it on the floor, and we'll move it out of the way here. We can see that if we were to print this in this direction, we would be building supports underneath this. And since this is the most important area, we want the shape of this to be smooth so that it can fit into the slots cut for it. So we should instead print it standing up. So I will grab my rotate tool. Before I get ready to print, I'm just going to set it standing up. These gaps are so small that we can probably bridge them without any support. And if they are a little bit droopy, well, it doesn't matter because we're going to put something flexible like ribbon in here, and we don't have to worry about this being a perfectly smooth surface. Since we print this standing up, we're going to have a perfectly shaped arrow here that is going to fit into our slot. All right. Hope you enjoyed this, and you can always add some more things to your symmetrical pattern and make your bow tie more and more ridiculous. We're going to be preparing our two-part print for the 3D printer. So I mentioned printing orientation and how we would want to print our backer handle part here standing up so that we did not have to support the overhangs on the arrow here. I'll show an example of how it would look in different orientations, and we can see what that actually means for our slicer. But first, let's export these two objects as separate STL files so that I can import them into the slicer one at a time. We'll take our backer object here, and we'll go to Export. And we're going to click on STL and make sure that we're doing only the selected shape so I don't get all the other junk in my design. All right, and it will create an STL file with the same name as our Tinkercad project. So click on my second part here, bow tie itself, and we'll go into export again, make sure it's just the selected shape, and hit STL. Since it's got the same name, it's just going to append a 1 to it, so I know that the number 1 is the actual bow tie. I can go in and rename them if I need to. So let's go into Cura. Now I've got Cura set up for our larger printer, which is a Creality CR10. Got plenty of space to fit, and I could probably print both of these parts at once. But in general, I like to print things one at a time, unless you have some parts that you know for sure are rock solid and you're not going to have to mess with anything or reprint them. You might spend a lot of time on a print, multiple pieces on it, and only get half of each part. So let's bring in our first part and zoom in so we can see this better. We can see that on its side, this orientation, if I look around, we've got all straight lines, and we have the bottom firmly attached to the floor, and these two red shapes here. Highlights in blue mean that they are on the floor, and highlights in red mean that they are unsupported. But I know that this is a 2mm space, tiny slot for us to put a ribbon through, which means that I think the printer can bridge this gap. If we were to print like this, without any supports, it would likely survive. So let's take a look at slices, preview it, so we can see what it would look like. This small part's only 75 layers, and as we scroll down, we can see that here, at level 66, printer is going to be drawing straight lines across the top here. Since it connects on both sides, the plastic should cool down as it comes out of the nozzle, and it might sag a little bit on this first layer. After it, we're going to have another completely solid layer on top of it. And you can see there's just enough space inside of here for it to draw infill. And this is a tiny area to change our orientation to make this strange little infill pattern. The infill is there to keep the inside of your parts hollow so that you use less material, take less time, and you still get a very strong part. Having a small little hollow space in this one part seems like a unnecessary bit. So for this tiny part, we can actually change our settings so that the infill is up to 100%. And we slice this, we'll see that it won't bother to change directions. It'll simply draw full lines all the way through. And it doesn't change the amount of time that it takes. Now, this is another reason that we will want to print our parts separately, because the settings that we use for this will be different from what we'll want to use for our larger piece. We probably don't want to print the bow tie with 100% infill, because the large sections on the side are going to be unnecessarily full of plastic and take a lot longer. If we wanted to print this with support, go back to prepare and we'll try it out with two versions of this. Let's drag a new one in. And we'll take our new model and rotate it so that the back side is on the floor. In your rotate controls, there is select face to align to build plate. You have this option selected. It will pick that side and line it up on the floor. to make it a lot easier to put flat surfaces onto the floor. Now let's move it out of the way so it's not intersecting. Turn on Generate Supports. And we'll see that in this instance, we have supports on the underside of the arrow, and we have these supports here. So if we slice this, we'll see in our preview, we're going to have a little tower of support material built on the edges here to keep this up. Because there's no way for it to attach to something on the other side, it's not a bridge, it's an overhang, and it will definitely drop down without these supports. But this does mean that you'll have to dig these supports out of the shape later. And with this being the direction of printing, the likelihood that pulling on the bow tie would crack this in the direction of layers is much higher than when you have your layers going perpendicular to where the stress is on your part. You can also see that if we build supports, we're going to build this tower in the center of this, which should be fairly easy to knock out, but I still think is unnecessary. We're only making a bridge a tinier gap instead. We're losing maybe 1 millimeter of bridge here. And it will increase the amount of time that it takes. So for this part, we'll go back to no supports and remove our flat version, and we can make this at 100% infill. We'll slice our first part, save the G-code, so that we can upload it for printing. Now we can quickly prepare the second part of our bow tie. Since we have designed it to lie down flat on the floor, we can see that, since I made these facets straight, they are at a slope that requires a little bit of support. But, as expected, the inside of our arrow type shape does not require supports because it is greater than the 55-degree angle that the printer expects for needing support. So if we put a little support around the underside of this, it should keep the bottom edge of this from sagging. Since it is the back side of our bow tie, if it gets a little bit rough there, it probably won't be seen while you're wearing it. Just to double check, everything else is directly on the ground. I can generate support around this part just to make it look as nice as possible and slice it. Take a look at the preview. This larger part's going to take quite some time. Although because it is mostly straight lines, I could decrease the quality, increasing the size of the layers themselves, and it might still look just fine and take a lot less time to print. Oh, of course, important part. Infill is still set to 100%. One reason this is going to take hours is that it's going to fill in all of these spaces here. They're solid with 100% lines. So that's going to take it quite some time. Let's set it back to the default 20 and see what that does. There we go, an hour and a half. Now we can see that halfway through, instead of printing thousands of lines back and forth to fill it in solid, we're printing our cubic pattern, which you can try out different infill patterns. And that means that all of the inside layers of our shape are just going to be filled in these diagonal lines. That'll keep it strong enough, but use less plastic and take less time. All right, now that we've checked settings are correct, we are ready to save this file send our G code off to be printed.